Hello and welcome to another guide for Nabateans Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at Nabatea, which is a quite interesting underdog faction. For one, their army is very reliant on camels, skirmishers, and axe units, creating a very unique composition, one unlike anything else found in the mod. Other than this, they start out somewhat sandwiched, not disastrously, but still sharing borders with both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, making them a weird, weak third player in the Syrian wars that unfold immediately at the start of the campaign. The roster is relatively light, very skirmish-oriented, and camel-based, making their army very unique, and one that stacks up quite obtusely against that of the Greeks, making the early game quite challenging. But as you progress into the late game, you can become a very wealthy faction, a very prosperous faction, and with a couple of reforms, a very strong faction militarily. So let's go check out their start position and figure out how best to use the Nabataeans in early game. Alright everybody, so this is the start position for the Nabataeans, and the first thing that you'll notice is that the Nabataeans start out with 3 settlements in their home province, and they own all of them from the early game, making this campaign seem deceptively easy. But what I'm hoping to showcase by the end of this little bit here is that the Nabataeans are ultimately a very, very challenging faction from the onset, and that has to do with the diplomatic situation and really just the strategic positioning of this province. It's actually really suboptimal, and you're basically forced to be a participant in the war between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, despite really not being a tough faction at the beginning of the campaign. Now, one thing I want you to note is that you start out the campaign as the trade partners of the Ptolemies. In fact, they're quite friendly towards you, for willing to entertain non-aggression pacts, military access pacts with really limited costs if you really want it. Like, you can get very close with these guys, but their liking of you is contrasted by the dislike of the Seleucids. And in my tests, the Seleucids have attacked me every single time, almost. Every single time, like turn 1, turn 2, the Seleucids will attack the Nabateans. So you have to be ready to support the Ptolemies and go up against the Seleucids, which is a little bit of an odd proposition, because at the end of the day, if you just went in for Jerusalem and took Yehuda, while the Seleucids kind of come in from this other direction, you guys could absolutely obliterate the Ptolemies. But because these guys are averse to you and these guys have befriended you, it's kind of the opposite situation. And the Seleucids might just invade Nabatea from Palmyra at any point. Like, you have to constantly be on the lookout for a Seleucid horde full of elite troops gunning towards Petra. And holding it will be a challenge, for your initial army as Nabatea is horrendous. Just look at these limited options, guys. And believe me, these options aren't elite or anything either. You have 3 infantry choices, all of which are levy tier. And they aren't even particularly great levy tier troops. Like, this levy spearman has 1 armor and no ammunition. These Bedouin spears have a total of 18 combats. But actually, let's look at the base stats. A total of 15 combat stats between melee attack and melee defense, which is horrendously low. Yes, these guys do pack a pretty reasonable shock element because they have 26 charge bonus as well as a volley of javelins. So these guys can be somewhat useful at times, but it's really, really not guaranteed that these guys will get anything done with low morale, you know, low armor, and ultimately just low weapon damage. Like, in a grind, these guys will get obliterated. Speaking of that, you have a pretty similar thing going on with these Nabatean axemen. For a while, their charge bonus is great and their armor penetration is remarkable. Once again, like, these guys will die in a grind out since their actual combat stats aren't great. The only thing here which is above average are your Nabatean archers, which come with 150 men rather than the customary 131 that most skirmishers come with. So if you recruit like 4 of these, that would be pretty logical, but otherwise you're kind of stuck with, you know, a core of horrendous levy spears here, because at least they have some holding potential. And then, you know, the rest of your army being axemen and Bedouins. truly grisly affair. Like, the only good thing is that you start out with this medium cavalry recruited already, so at least you have reasonable cavalry between this unit and your general. There's nothing great here, and your mercenaries aren't going to save you as Nabatea either, or rather lower tier options. Now, the good thing, of course, is that you do have a full province, so you can recruit your armies quite quickly. The Nabateans are a very economically well-off faction. Just from the very onset, you have great income, so you can spam armies of these low-tier troops, and of course, get the buildings necessary to make better troops. For example, you can get this animal breeder, which will give you access to both your cavalry trees here. So, like, ultimately, if you go for these guys, you'll have some cavalry options. Your tier 1 comes with a couple of camels, as well as these Arabian light cavalry. And all of these units come from your 3rd tier too. So you can recruit a ton of these guys, and they'll definitely give you a bit of an edge. Like, I would honestly build the animal breeder as quickly as possible. As well as, I don't know, you can use this building slot just to deal with your sanitation and public order in one foul swoop. Over here, you can try to boost public order with one of these buildings, because you don't really need to perpetuate more of your culture. You start out with 100% from the very onset, so just one of these, and you can get food from, your fishing settlement, upgrade your capital, boost your tax revenue here or something like that. Like, there's a lot of great options for you. But when it comes to your initial technology stuff, I would just go straight for the military line if I were you, because you don't start out with any military technology. You have to get logistics here, which is an 8-turn wait just to upgrade to your tier 2 infantry barrack. And you really need these infantry units. Like, you can see here, you're going to get access to your heavier axemen, which is absolutely essential. Your furrow swordsman, which comes a little bit later. Some better peltas. Admittedly, it's really your level 3 that's going to make a difference, because your 1 elite tier infantry unit, at least from early game, comes from this building. So that's going to be really important. But yeah, otherwise, it's mainly your cavalry that's going to do the killing, so you should prioritize making this building happen. Additionally, once you upgrade to your level 2 town hall, you get access to these medium spearmen. They're not great, but at least it's a tier 2, kind of a mid-tier infantry unit that you can make use of. So that's how you're going to beef up your initial army offerings, because these options are quite paltry. Now, when it comes to your continued expansion in this campaign, my recommendation is just play defensively against the Seleucids and stay out of Ptolemaic territory. The thing is, because the Seleucids are going to be torn between so many enemies, you don't really need to confront them head on. And if you send an army north towards Palmyra, you ultimately will become a part of this conflict. You'll be drawn in. The Seleucids will hound whatever you conquer in Palmyra. And I don't really think that that's worth it. I don't really think that's a great thing for you. Like, making gains in this highly competitive region is going to be extremely bloody, and your troops are worse than that of the Seleucids for most of the game. So I would just stay out of that. Personally, I would dive into Arabia Magna and just conquer your Arab rivals. Particularly this province, Arabia Felix down here, is so defensible and so wealthy, but even like sending an army just down south towards Eudemon would pay dividends immediately. I mean, to be completely frank, conquering this like successor territory is so much more difficult to hold and maintain than just conquering these Arabian regions, and these guys will have way more cultural affinity with you, as in they will be of your culture almost entirely. So conquering this territory just makes sense. It'll integrate into your empire so well. Additionally, like, your early game army is bad, but your late game army is good. And that trend is followed by your fellow Arab factions, which all start out with pretty terrible troops at the beginning. So just watch as they attack each other, send some spies over, and kind of just go in and take for settlements when they're not even guarding them. You can do that considering how many settlements you have, and most of these factions are just one and done factions. So you can just go in and take them. And that would be my strategy. Like, once you've consolidated most of Arabia under your banners, then I would go and focus on the successors. You'll be wealthier, you'll probably be past your reforms, you'll actually have access to good troops, and then you can go and storm Hellenic territory and take it for yourself. And those are my recommendations when it comes to the Nabatean campaign. Now let's go look at the buffs and debuffs for his faction, as well as the roster that they have to play with. Now, when it comes to the buffs and debuffs that Nabatea has, they ultimately aren't very consequential. For a lot of factions, the buffs and debuffs actually control a good measure of how the faction plays, you know? The incentives make you go in one direction, and then the debuff makes you avoid something entirely, making the faction have a unique feel. Nabatea has a very neutral feel. Like, you generally have some nice economic buffs up here with the Arab buffs, but ultimately, because they're not paired with nearly as many economic buffs down here, it doesn't make Nabatea feel like a very powerful economic faction like Saba does. Like, Nabatea feels... I mean, you're still more powerful economically than the average faction. Like, the barbarian factions definitely don't have income boosts like Nabatea has up here. But they're not as overpowered. They're not as prominent. Then the debuffs and buffs down here are very, very, very general. And this debuff kind of cancels up what's up here. So ultimately, Nabatea doesn't feel like a faction that has a unique character when it comes to the buffs and debuffs. It feels very, very neutral. Now, the economic buffs that you get are the general Arab ones, which are plus 10% wealth from all commerce buildings and plus 50% in slave resource production. Now, these two are good because obviously plus 10% for all commerce buildings will just make you generally more wealthy. Then the plus 50% spice and slave resource production are great because you do have both of these resources down in Arabia Felix, where Saba starts, and ultimately as Nabatea, you're most likely going to conquer those regions that province as part of your early conquests. So having both these buffs does make your economy generally better. You know, it'll probably add like an additional 1,000 to your income over time, maybe 2,000, but at the end of the day, it's kind of canceled out a little bit by this debuff down here, the increased empire maintenance debuff. And obviously increased empire maintenance is just like a general tax that you pay. And while these two economic buffs are kind of kind of specific, you know, this is just like a general economic debuff that I feel cancels these out. At least like 50% of this. So at the end of the day, like, your economy is barely boosted at all. Now, what are the buffs then? What are the buffs? Because if these two get canceled out by this one, then these two are the ones that are actually going to have an impact on your playstyle. One of them, Stonecutter, lower city construction cost. This just doesn't do anything. Like, at the end of the day, you should have no trouble making money as long as you're conquering, as long as you're sacking settlements, as long as you're raising settlements, as long as you're looting the settlements, as long as you're releasing captives, as long as you're making preferable trade deals. You should be able to afford any building upgrade, and just having general lower city construction costs, this is only going to impact your first couple of turns, because ultimately your kind of early game income is preset at a certain level, and you know, you're going to want to upgrade your initial province right away. So outside of making it much easier to build up your first province, this is going to have zero impact on your campaign. But increased growth, it's like a nice thing to have. It's nice to have your population grow at a generally faster rate, but it's just not something that actually has a humongous impact on the general feel of the campaign. And for these reasons, Nabatea just has a generally neutral feel, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the buffs and debuffs feel unfair. Sometimes the buffs aren't very good and the debuff is terrible. But at the end of the day, Nabatea doesn't really benefit or have anything taken away. It's a very neutral feeling campaign, which, you know, a neutral feeling campaign is ultimately saved or destroyed by how interesting the army that the faction has. So let's go look at the Nabatean army, see if they're any good, see if they're interesting, see if they offer a unique challenge. Now, unsurprisingly, considering what I just said, the Nabatean army does offer a unique challenge. A very, very unique challenge. They are unlike any other faction that I've ever seen. And you know what? Saba was also a pretty unique feeling faction. You know, they ultimately felt like a very underpowered faction that was just generally behind because of their relative isolation on the map. You know, they felt almost like the old Persians or something like that. And ultimately, the Nabataeans also have a very unique feel to them. Except, they definitely don't feel like they've been isolated from conflict. It just feels like they've taken a very unique Arabian twist on some Hellenic style units. And of course, they're kind of the more martial Arab faction compared to the Sabaeans, who are kind of more relaxed. They're more laid back. You know, they've been able to prosper and stew in their wealth for too long. The Nabateans, in contrast, feel a lot more warlike, but, you know, for Arabs. So they have a lot of tools that are more common in the style of warfare that, you know, the Arabians employ, like the use of axes, the use of camels, of course, you know, the supremacy of lighter skirmish style fighting compared to rather heavy combat. But they also take certain things from the Greeks and Persians too. So let's go look at this faction in totality and see if they're strong or not. Because while they are very interesting, you know, in some departments, they are absolutely terrible. While in some, you know, they're generally bad, but maybe they have like one good unit or something like that. So this roster, it's a little odd, it's a little wonky, and I wouldn't really call the Nabateans like a power faction, but in total, I would say that they're pretty strong, but that's only if you bring the right tools. Now when it comes to the generals that Nabatea has, you have three options. And all of these are available from early games, so you don't have to worry about any reforms. You can play as any of these generals right from the start. However, some of them are a little bit underwhelming compared to others. Now, your first option is this Nabatean bodyguard infantry, and this is the one elite spear infantry unit that you have as Nabatea. And if you look at the combat stats, they actually look really darn powerful. Like, this isn't defensive style spears, so don't expect the craziest charge bonus or, you know, armor penetration like the Volki spear have of the Aravachi. Like these guys, you can see like a charge bonus of 29, an armor penetration of 6 on a spear unit. You know, forget about stats like these. This is a defensive spear. But this is a really powerful defensive spear. Like 22 melee defense is insane. 28 weapon damage is great for a spear. That's only like 2 less than a sword unit, which is crazy. Spears generally have less weapon damage, so to have 28 is absolutely phenomenal for a spear. 35 armor is decent. It's alright. It's, you know, not great for an elite unit, but considering that this unit has high charge bonus, incredible combat stats of 10 and 22, and, you know, a strong 52 morale, it's forgivable that this unit doesn't have great armor. You know, it has good armor in general, but not great armor for an elite unit. And it has no javelins. But this unit does have one catch, but I don't think a lot of people would pick up immediately. And that's right here. You see, a unit's melee defense is a composition of 2 different stats that each unit has. One's the base value, and one's the shield value. The base value represents the unit's actual, like, combat ability. Like, how good are these guys? How nimble are they? Are they capable of dodging blows? You know, are they well-trained warriors who are capable of actually sparring in combat and block blows, avoid blows, stuff like that? Shield value has to do with their equipment, like how good the shield is. And that shield value also translates to a unit's missile block chance. You know, what's the likelihood that a unit can actually block an incoming arrow, an incoming volley of javelins? And this unit has a really high base value, but not a good shield value. And you actually want the shield value to be much higher than 6. Like, 6 actually represents a pretty poor shield on this unit, which means that this unit actually can get destroyed by enemy skirmishers quite easily. Now, admittedly, the Nabataeans do have great skirmishers, so you can most likely win this skirmish if you actually bring many. But ultimately, having a mostly defensive unit be so bad against javelins, against arrows, against slings, it is kind of self-defeating. You know, you want a defensive unit to be able to tank slings, to be able to tank arrows, to be able to take all the projectiles hurled at your force. I mean, you want them to be resilient against this type of thing. And because this unit isn't, I would say it has somewhat questionable utility. Like, I've actually tested this unit out extensively, and while they actually do really well if they don't get hit by anything before they get into combat, even one volley of javelins thrown by, like, an Arverni Oathsworn or like a Roman Praetorian will ensure that this unit gets absolutely obliterated by an elite sword. They are really bad at blocking missiles. So be wary. Like, this unit, while it is great in combat, it does take a while to kill because of course, poor melee attack. This is a defensive spear, even though the stats, the melee defense and attack add up to a really great number, making this unit really effective in combat. It will take a while for this unit to whittle down the numbers of the enemy. So ultimately, like, while these guys do great in combat, even like one volley of javelins will make them lose against an equally priced sword unit. So you have to be very, very careful with them. But moving on, you have these Nabatean noble camel riders, and these guys are excellent. This is an elite camel archer. It comes with 90 men. So, you know, whatever stats you see up here, you know, you have to lower your expectations somewhat, because ultimately a 90-person unit will not always have, like, as great stats as a 75 rider equivalent. They need to balance this out, you know? But these guys are incredible archers. Absolutely incredible archers. 18 missile damage is elite. 170 range is absolutely amazing for a mounted archer. These guys shoot relatively quick at 6 shots per minute. Like, not amazing, but this is equivalent to, like, you know, your typical standard archer that's on the ground. You know, 15 ammo, which is normal. And the combat stats of this unit are okay. Like, 9 melee attack and 5 melee defense is not great, although passable considering that this unit is ultimately an archer unit. You know, 39 charge bonus is admittedly pretty bad, although these guys will still do damage against infantry, but 29 weapon damage is crazy! And 33 armor is pretty dang solid, as well as 7 speed, which is really good considering how armored this unit is. It's just, this unit actually can do pretty good damage in a melee, especially against enemy cavalry, which is what I've noticed. Like, they won't obliterate, like, an elite enemy cavalry unit if you just charge them in without them shooting anything. But if these guys get a couple of volleys off against, like, an elite, like, late game barbarian cavalry, like a Dacian elite cav style unit, and then charge in after, I have found them to win that confrontation most of the time. So don't underestimate these guys in melee, and they're just exceptionally good archers. You know, I feel like using a horse archer general might be somewhat unorthodox for a lot of players, but try these guys out. They are great. And the other thing is that camel units in Rome 2 scare horses. So these guys are really good against enemy cavalry because they'll actually demoralize them, making them a lot easier to rout. So this is kind of like a hidden buff, which actually has a huge impact on how cavalry versus camel confrontations go. In fact, I've noticed that camels win decisively most of the time. So just because these guys have those anti-cavalry characteristics, these combat stats, just because they're decent, will make this an exceptionally strong unit. Like, this unit doesn't need elite tier combat stats. They just need decent to allow them to carry the day against enemy cavalry. Now, your other option are the Nabatean bodyguard cavalry, which I just think are so much more boring than the noble camel riders. I just take the camel riders because they're cool of the 3 of these any day of the week. Plus also useful. More useful than this unit in my opinion, because this unit is just very, very average. You know, this kind of feels like a Greek-style cavalry unit because it has the same characteristic stats that a Greek kind of like an elite, you know, kind of like a, what is it called? Like a elite citizen cavalry style general would have. Like it has 10 melee attack, 15 melee defense, which are pretty boring, like honestly below average by barbarian standards, but average by Greek standards. 50 charge bonus, 27 weapon damage. Like this is literally the same style of unit as like, I think a Rhodian, no, this is a javelin cavalry. I'm trying to remember which, no, this is more of a melee style cavalry. I'm trying to find an equivalent, but I'm flopping here a little bit. You know, maybe it is more reminiscent of a barbarian style cavalry, to be fair. I mean, it's exactly the same as Massilian, except there's a key difference, but let's go find more equivalents. It's going to be the same as the Boii one as well. See your exact same stats. Like every single melee cavalry general has this stat line, except most, if not all of them, have 17 melee defense instead of 15 melee defense. The reason why this one has less is that this unit has 8 speed, which is insane. This unit is extraordinarily fast, making it like the ideal unit to go kill skirmishers, the ideal unit to go run like really dangerous maneuvers and just hit like a crazy hammer and anvil or something like that. Like this unit is incredibly great at being flexible and kind of being a jack of all trades. But that's what this unit is. It is kind of like a generic, just really fast and strong cavalry. This is a lot more of like an X Factor type unit. Imagine a bunch of camels getting behind an enemy, shooting volley after volley, and then just running in on a countercharge against enemy cavalry. It's absolute madness. But moving on to the Nabatean melee infantry. The melee infantry of Nabatea are pretty unorthodox because 3 out of 4 of them are axemen. For single-handed axe units. Which, you know, Saba is very similar. The Arabs love using axes in warfare. But because you mainly have axe units, you really don't have a lot of defensive capabilities to your units until you hit the 4-axe reforms and you get these guys. But believe me, that's going to hold you back. In general, like, your army kind of lacks stability because you don't have a strong infantry backbone. In fact, infantry are undeniably the main weakness of Nabatea. And this should become quite apparent quite soon. Now, your first unit is just a levy tier axe unit. You know, we went over them on the campaign map for the Nabatean axemen. The main weakness of this unit is that it has very poor morale at 33. You combine this with a 9 melee defense, and these guys, they just die really easily. They don't have a great shield value. They only have a shield value of 6, so these guys are quite vulnerable to ammunition. The 8 armor of these guys absolutely won't save this unit in combat. It's just this unit is all bluster and no stability. They run in with 26 charge bonus. They do quite a bit of damage, particularly hitting the flank because of all of this armor penetrating damage. But ultimately, if they get confronted by almost anything frontally, they'll just run away screaming because of poor morale and poor melee defense. These guys have absolutely no stability, but they use camels for transportation and they move faster on the campaign map because of that. So in general, a lot of Nabatean units have this trait, and this will make Nabatean armies a lot more mobile when it comes to maneuvering around the campaign map, which is of course an advantage, particularly when invading Arabia, which is just a really vast and large province. But your next unit are the Nabatean Phraeus swordsmen, and these guys are like virtually any other Phraeus swordsman, meaning that they're kind of crap. Now, this unit is a bit different than the average Greek variant, because the typical Greek Phraeus sword, that being the one that almost any faction has, like with the exception of Athens and Pergamon that have special versions, but this version, it has 15 armor rather than the typical 8 armor that a Greek version would have. But they don't have the extra javelins. They only have 1 javelin, while most of the Greek ones have 3 javelins. I mean, I think that's kind of a fair trade-off. Like, 15 armor is a quite significant upgrade over 8. 8 is like low-tier armor. 15 is actually getting into the lower end of being like a mid-tier infantry. But the combat stats of his unit are just pathetically low. Like 9 melee defense and 12 melee attack is okay, but 15 charge bonus is unforgivable. And 23 weapon damage is just really, really bad. Because of these stats, like the Freyo Swordsman is just universally not a good unit. It also has really poor morale at 36. So these guys are quite easy to scare off. And because of that, these guys won't really be a stable backbone either. Nor will they really be a shock component since, you know, ultimately 15 charge bonus and 23 weapon damage makes them completely poor at being like a good flanking unit. So, you know, use these guys at your peril. Like, they're not going to be the type of unit you have on your flanks. They're not going to be the type of unit you want in your center, but you might be forced to have them in your center because they come from your third population class. And a lot of other units just that come from your second population class are honestly not really worth it. So you might end up using these guys as a center, but this 36 base morale will make them quite bad at it. So this is a unit that you might be stuck with, but it's not a very good unit. But moving on, to Nabatean heavy infantry. They come from your second population class. They get unlocked with your second tier infantry barracks, so they're pretty accessible. But they're just like an okay axe unit. They're an okay axe unit. They're worse than a lot of Celtic axemen are. Like, for example, this Bowie axeman is better. They have one more melee defense compared to this Nabatean axeman, as well as, you know, a volley of javelins. They have more armor. You know, this Nabatean axeman just honestly is a little bit worse than your average barbarian axeman. It's still a solid axeman, but they'll get beat by so much infantry. You know, and that's really just apparent in their stats. Like, only 9 melee attack and 10 melee defense. Like, this unit is not, like, an elite tier infantry by any means. Like, they're very much like a middle of mid tier, maybe lower mid tier unit because of these two things. Like, they're just really regrettably low. Now, 28 charge bonus is great, but this is an axe unit, so we expect them to have a shock component. And this charge bonus is really offset by really bad weapon damage at 19. I know they have 14 armor penetration, you know, because we're an axe unit. But then also 25 armor isn't good. Like, this unit is more reminiscent of some of the weaker axes in the game, like the Arverni axemen. You know, actually, well, I mean, honestly, not horrendously different. Like, only a little bit better in most stats, and pretty similar armor, and these guys have more speed and they have a volley of javelins. Like, this unit just isn't particularly good, and they don't cost much more than the Arverni axe unit. Like, these guys aren't a particularly strong axe unit. Like, I think that I sound like a broken record here. I don't remember any other barbarian faction having like an axe that was bad. I mean, you know, this one's pretty similar. They have one more melee defense, but they also have a volley of javelins. You know, this unit is better, actually. Same armor. Like, a lot of the weaker Celtic axemen are still better than this Nabatean heavy infantry. You know, and because they aren't stable, you know, lower side of armor, no javelins, meaning that if they get javelined when going into combat. And of course, these guys have the poor shields I was talking about, the 6 shield value shields. So with their pretty bad armor for like a mid-tier infantry, combined with those bad shields, are pretty vulnerable. So I hope I ripped this unit apart sufficiently. Like, it's poor compared to a lot of mid-tier axemen. They have bad shields, they don't have great armor, the lack of, you know, javelin volley is honestly a little bit sad, because basically every other axe unit has javelins, including, when actually your levy tier doesn't, but like, Sabaean axemen, they all have javelins for the most part, don't they? I mean, this Arabian axeman does, and this Sabaean axeman does, and the Sabaean axeman is honestly a better unit. You know, more melee defense, they have more movement speed, they have the ammunition. Like, these heavy axemen just aren't great, they're very slow. They aren't an amazing unit, but they're kind of the best that you have amongst your melee infantry until you get into the 4-axe reforms, which the 4-axe reforms for the Nabataeans come late, because it's not when the Greeks get it, it's when the factions that are influenced by the Greeks get them. So you get these guys like turn 140. They're a very late game unit, but they are really, really good. Like, I've tested them out against elite tier Celtic infantry, against elite tier Roman infantry, and they actually win most of the time. This is probably the best axe unit in the game. Like, comparing them to elite tier, you know, Arabia, not even about like Persian axe units. Let's go to Parthia. Oh yeah, way better than this. Like, let's go to the Germans. The Germans have the best axe units in the game. Because this unit's better than any Celtic axeman. I've already tested that. And I haven't really looked at the Germans a whole lot yet, so... You know, those guys haven't been... I think the Kimberly, they have the best axe units, right? Veteran swordsman. Yeah, it's better than this unit, statistically. It's better than... This unit does have really good weapon damage, but poor armor penetration for an axe unit. No, it's better than this unit statistically. Like, this is most likely the best single-handed axe unit. In fact, I'm confident in calling this the best single-handed axe unit. I don't think I've, you know, missed any rocks that I should have flipped over. This is the best single-handed axe unit. It has absurd combat stats for an axe unit. 11 and 12, like, usually these are the stats that hold it back, but this unit almost has the same combat stats as an elite sword. 30 charge bonus is ludicrous for a unit like this, and this unit has a good shield. It has a 7 shield value. Shield, you know, close to the Romans almost. 20 weapon damage is not great, of course. Not amazing. I mean, I just called the Furo swords with a whopping 23 weapon damage crap. But this unit has 15 armor penetration, which totally offsets this and makes it good. 35 armor is an okay, not great, and 48 base morale is okay, not great for an elite tier unit. But this just combination of insane armor penetration combined with these combat stats makes this unit amazing. Like, I've seen it beat Praetorians, I've seen it beat Oathsworn, I've seen it beat Galatian 4-axe swords. This unit is absolutely phenomenal. The only weakness it has compared to, like, you know, elite swords is that these guys are a little bit weaker when it comes to getting flanked because the melee defense isn't the best. You know, the somewhat low armor will make these guys more exposed to skirmishers and stuff. Not like weak to skirmishers, but a bit weaker compared to a lot of elite swords in the game. So these guys are a little bit less stable, I would say. But ultimately, their insane offensive capabilities makes these guys absurdly powerful. But again, you have to wait till turn 140. Your campaign will be mostly over by then. So you have these 3 options to work with, which are not super competitive options normally. And your spears don't bail you out either. Let's start with the spears off. So the first spear that you have are the Nabatean levy spearmen. If these guys aren't a particularly strong levy spear in any regard, they have 33 base morale, which is crap. No javelin volley, no armor. You know, the only thing about this unit which makes it better than some levy spears is that it has 14 melee defense compared to 12, which a lot of units have, but you know, lack of armor and the ammunition really doesn't make this a worthy gain. This unit sucks. It's a horrible levy spearman. The only good thing is that it's cheap. Your Bedouin spearmen, they move faster because they use camels for transportation. And as I covered before, they do have some pretty good offensive capabilities. You know, 5 armor penetration is good for a levy tier spear. 26 charge bonus is really good for a levy tier spear. These guys are like a baby shock spear unit. And they do have 1 volley of ammunition, which is good. They're also extraordinarily cheap to maintain. But they do have poor morale, poor melee defense, only 8 armor. These guys in a protracted fight will get absolutely crapped on by anything remotely heavy. But if these guys don't get attacked by anything heavy, and you mostly use them to maneuver around in the flanks, you know, get those javelins off, counter cavalry tactics, then they can be good. But they're just extremely squishy. You know, they're kind of a little bit of a shock element to have in your army, and just a really cheap unit. But they're not something that you're actually going to use in combat all that regularly. Your medium spearmen should be a unit that you can, but they're just not good. They're just not good. 39 base morale is really low for a unit that is like of this caliber. Like it's really low for a mid-tier unit. Really low. And they also don't have any javelins. The melee stats leave something to be desired with only 7 melee attack and 16 melee defense. Like, you'd expect a good, you know, a medium, like truly a medium tier spearman to have way better melee stats than this. You know, 22 weapon damage is paltry. It's pathetic. It's It's beaten by your Bedouin spears. It's really close to your Levy spears. I mean, this is worse than Pharaoh's swords. This is terrible. And 25 armor is really not that good. This unit is just incredibly lackluster. It's like a beefed up Levy spearman, but I wouldn't even call it a mid-tier unit. It's like an upper lower tier unit, and they come from your second population class, which is horrible. Because overall, this is a terrible unit. The next unit's not much better. I mean, they have almost identical stats. They're your caravan guards. You can recruit them with any, like any trade building. Like there's like one of those civic buildings that you can make in your capital settlements, your provincial capitals, the walled settlements. There's like one of those yellow color-coded buildings that allows you to recruit one of these. You can also get them from your naval chain with like the trading harbor style building, but ultimately this unit's not better than this unit. Like they have the exact same stats, except the caravan guard has 1 less morale, but they have 5 ammunition, and these aren't javelins, these are bow shots. They have little bows on their backs. You know, 5 arrows really isn't going to make up for these paltry and pathetic stats. I mean, it makes these guys better than these guys. Undeniably, they come from the same population class too. So if you have the option of recruiting these over the medium spearmen, I would take the caravan guard 100% of the time. But it's not like 5 arrow shots is going to make this unit good. It's still a terrible unit. And your next unit is the Nabatean bodyguard, which, as we mentioned before, are incredibly good at melee combat. But for an elite tier spear that comes from your first population class and costs a lot to maintain, you know, this unit has the really weird negative trait of being pretty weak to ammunition, pretty weak to any type of projectile. So ultimately, use these guys at your own peril, but out of all of your infantry, this is the best unit you have by far until the 4X reforms when you get these guys. I turned like 140 because it's not the Greek 4X reforms, it's the foreigner 4X reforms. So it's like, this unit really is a super flawed, you know, unit that this army depends on. Outside of this, you have some crappy but cheap spears down here, some extremely lackluster medium spears, like barely worthy of being called a mid-tier infantry, not even worthy to be honest, a subpar medium-tier axe unit, a crappy 4X Pharaoh's sword, and low-tier axe units, which are decent low-tier shock unit, cost-effective, but not a good unit. Like, this unit has cost-effectiveness, but nothing good until you get to these late Nabatean infantry. These guys are actually really good. These guys are really good, but everything else is super flawed. And these units are going to have to compensate. You know, your skirmishers and your cavalry have to uplift the infantry. So let's move on to those. The skirmishers of Nabatea are generally quite good. I'm going to be completely honest with you. Like, they're good units. You start out with these Arabian light infantry, and while these guys aren't amazing skirmishers, they are really cheap. They're super duper cheap. But, you know, they have generic javelin statistics. You know, 80 range, 20 missile damage, nothing great. But these guys do have a catch. They use axes. So they do 15 armor penetrating damage, which is crazy for a skirmisher this cheap. You know, it's not like you're going to use these guys to like win extremely high stakes battles, but you know, having this much offensive capability in a unit that's dirt cheap is pretty good. You know, you throw javelins, you go in with axes. If you throw your javelins and get 1 charge off on these units, they've more than paid for themselves. Moving on, you have Nabatean slingers, and this isn't like an exceptional sling unit by any means, but they have shields, which is better than a lot of Celtic units that don't. And they have, you know, 190 range and 11 missile damage, which is, you know, it's what you want. You know, this is a good slinger, but for some reason they're really, really cheap. This unit is really, really cheap compared to a lot of units I've seen with equivalent stats. You know, and while these guys absolutely don't have any melee capabilities, the unit is horrible in melee, it actually is a really good deal. So these slingers are solid. These archers are fantastic. They have 150 men, making them better than any generic Greek archer, the generic Carthaginian archers, all the generic Celtic archers. This is a solid unit that kind of takes after the Persian style of just having extra large archer units. And Persian archers are amazing. So considering that that's the influence that shapes this 150-man unit, they are a great archer unit. Now, it's not like this archer is like insane. It's just for the price that you pay to be a unit recruitable from your from your third population class and being super cheap, this unit's great. You know, they have generic archer damage, 15 missile damage, 165 range, so they aren't as good as like the Kushite generic archers or anything, but they're still really, really good. And they have 32 base morale, which is higher than the average 30. So these guys are a way above average generic tier archer. Now, with the Pharos reforms, you get these Nabatean peltas. You don't actually get a lot of units with the Pharos reforms. You just get the swordsman, and you get the Nabatean peltas. I think that's it. Oh, you also get this Nabatean heavy camel rider, which is a really important unit for you, by the way. But with the Pharos reforms, you get this unit. And this unit is actually an elite peltas. Like, for an elite unit at pelting, they do 22 missile damage and 90 range, which is really, really good. Now, for melee statistics are a little bit flawed because they are ultimately an axe-using peltist. You know, 5 melee attack and 9 melee defense are not particularly strong, and 16 weapon damage is really low, but they do have 12 armor penetration and 24 charge bonus, making this a unit that will die in a long-term grind, but a unit that also has immense shock capabilities. And they're also pretty cheap. These guys are surprisingly cheap. Like, they do come from your second population class. However, they are very, very easy to maintain for a peltas unit. So great bang for buck. Like, the 4 units I just covered are all fantastic deals when it comes to how much damage they do compared to how much they cost. And they're all above average in their class, in my opinion. Like, even this peltas, like, it actually has elite peltas stats and does well in the charge. Like, sure, it's not going to last super long in combat like a Greek peltas, but this unit is really easy to get your money out of because they just go in and hit like a hammer. Sure, they die quick, but they hit like a hammer. Now, this Frontier Guard, this is your elite archer option, and they are quite solid as archers. Like, 175 range and 16 missile damage is nothing to scoff at. But their melee capabilities are that of a shock spear. You know, 10 melee attack, 10 melee defense, very balanced. 21 weapon damage, which is pretty low. But 23 charge bonus, which is really high for a spear. I don't really like this unit's melee stats, to be honest. I just don't see what it'll make it great at, because it still has 10 armor. Meaning that it will die in combat quite readily. Quite a bit. Quite quickly, and I just don't really see why this unit would be worth it. They also only have 131 men compared to the 150 men of your regular archers, meaning that these guys, like, once they get into range, I feel like they will be almost as effective at range. And it's not like the melee capabilities of this unit is anything wondrous. So, in all honesty, I don't think that these guys are great. I would personally just stick to your Nabatean archers. I just feel like they're far better, like more above the average compared to these Frontier Guard, and spend more money on your cavalry, because the cavalry also has to be really good in order to offset the weakness of your infantry, to be honest. Now, when it comes to your cavalry, your first offering are the camel attendants, and this is just a super cost-effective unit. You know, it's not a great unit. They're just cost-effective because they have 3 ammunition, they throw little darts, little mini javelins. You know, they have 11 armor, which is okay for a unit that comes through your third population class and is really cheap. They're super fast at 7 speed. You know, they do okay weapon damage, they scare horses. They're great for killing skirmishers. They're good if you kind of like rear charge them into a cavalry brawl because you will scare the enemy horses away. They're insanely cheap for cavalry. They move really quickly. They are pretty solid all in all. Jack of all trades for like low tier light cavalry, just in that category. Your Nabatea and medium cavalry, these come from your second tier cavalry barrack. And in all honesty, they are okay. but not great because they come in with axes, which is a little bit weird for a unit like this, but they also throw 4 javelins, you know, they have 8 speed, they have 90 men. They're just overall a pretty useful unit, but don't get them charged by enemy cavalry because the low armor, the low charge bonus, the low weapon damage, I feel like these guys will be pretty bad at head-on engagements against enemy cavalry, but they're good for killing skirmishers. They're good into going into the rear of cavalry engagements and stuff like that, just for not like a mainline cavalry unit. That role will likely be played by Nabatean Lancers. These guys come from the Furos reforms, if the weight, but they have like 28 armor, 42 morale, you know, pretty okay-ish, like kind of low-end elite tier, like companion cavalry stats. Like these guys are pretty similar to Thessalians in my opinion, and they have 8 speed, so they're incredibly quick. Just these Lancers are also a little bit squishy, you know, 28 armor and 42 base morale is kind of on the lower end of mid-tier. So be careful about these guys getting too roughed up, but if these guys go in first and the Nabatean medium cavalry going from behind, it could be a pretty strong wombo combo. But between these 3 you have some pretty cost-effective kind of like lower mid-tier options. But Nabatean heavy cavalry, they also come from the Freos reforms, I believe, and they're just okay. They're just okay. I mean, these stats are really uninspired. These guys are essentially a citizen cavalry. The only difference is that they have 8 speed, making them quicker than any Greek citizen cavalry. But ultimately, the stats aren't amazing. If you only have 75 men, if this unit had 90 men, it'd actually be really strong, but at 75, this unit kind of lackluster. Nabatean bodyguard, we already covered them, you know? They come from our first population class. Their stats are nothing to behold, but the speed of 8 makes them just a really effective kind of all-around cavalry, making them definitely better than the Nabatean heavy cavalry. I feel like they're just a far superior option, but they also come from first population class. Like, there's nothing wrong with this unit, but just consider if you want to spend your first population class on a unit that kind of lacks a little bit of zest, a little bit of umph. Now with the Thorax reforms, you get this heavy Nabatean Lancers, and I wish that I could say that the weight's worth it, but the weight is not. This unit's actually terrible. I'm going to claim here, but it's actually the worst elite cavalry in Divide et Impera. I tested these guys out, and they can't beat anything. Even if they get like a charge, and the enemy cavalry like glitches out and just randomly stops moving, these guys often lose against equivalently priced enemy elite cavalry. And the reason why is found quite clearly in the combat stats. Melee attack of 10 is not good. Melee defense of 8 is not good. Weapon damage of 18 is pathetic. Doesn't matter, but they have a good charge bonus and armor penetration and good armor. These 3 stats I just mentioned, the 3 combat stats, completely nullify any purpose to this cavalry. Sure, if they charge into stationary Numidians, they'll win. But they're just so bad considering that this is supposed to occupy the elite tier of a Eastern factions cavalry. And it's because of this unit and this like the general kind of lack of excitement at the top tier of the regular cavalry that Nabatea has, that I recommend that you use mostly camels for your elite tier. Like the medium tier, the mid tier, but like the Nabatean medium cavalry and the Lancers and stuff, like these are decent units for the price and they can have some utility, but the elite tiers don't really, other than the Nabatean heavy cavalry, sorry, but Nabatean bodyguard cavalry, which is a little bit uninspired. You know, it's not a very interesting unit. But like these units are far better, the missile cavalry. Between these, you get some real winners, and you start out with the Bedouin Camel Scout. Now this unit is, in general, a pretty decent, cheap unit, because they have the same combat stats as the Camel Attendants. And the same weapon damage. They literally have the exact same combat capabilities as the Camel Attendants, except they have less armor. But instead of the armor, they have 6 ammunitions of reasonably strong javelins and 90 men to throw them with. So because of that, I'd actually say these guys are way better than the camel attendants. Always take Bedouin camel scouts over attendants. They only cost a little bit more, if it is way better, because 11 armor is nothing. 11 armor is not going to save your camel attendants from great peril. 4 armor is almost the same practically, but actually having the javelins means way more. These guys are just as good at killing skirmishers, going into the rear of cavalry engagements to scare enemy horses. They're just as good. Arabian light cavalry sucks. This is a completely useless skirmish cavalry. Always bring the camel attendants, never bring the cavalry, the light cavalry. Sure, these guys have axes, so they do armor penetrating damage, but these guys are horrible, don't bring them. Your Nabatean camel archers, these come from your level 2 camel barrack, so you have to wait a little bit to get them, but they are really, really strong. They actually have the exact same combat stats as these Nabatean nobles, they just have far less armor, so it doesn't work out for them as often. They only have 4 armor. But, you know, they're pretty solid archers. Like, 150 range, 60 missile damage, that's good for a horse archer of, like, a middling tier. So this unit's just, like, okay. Like, very a solid horse archer, but they do come from your second population class, making them a little bit harder to justify. Like, I feel like there's far better units offered from your, like, regular horse barrack and your second population class. But if you only have camels in your, like, you know, only have camels in a province, then you might be compelled to bring them. But if you have both, I would actually pick mostly from the horse class, because the 4 armor combined with only 33 base morale makes these guys a little bit weak. You know, 150 range isn't great, but, you know, they still scare horses. They still have pretty good melee stats. As long as these guys don't get charged, I feel like they'll do reasonably well in combat. And if you can get their ammunition off beforehand, they definitely will probably be combat effective. But these Nabatean horse archers are just way better. Longer range, way better missile damage. 17 missile damage is elite tier. They have 23 armor, which is pretty good. 8 speed, so they're still incredibly fast. And but good melee stats, man. 31 weapon damage is really, really high. Like, these guys punch in melee. They have some armor penetration. They have good armor. Amazing speed, max speed. Like, this unit's just all around great. 90 men, they're medium mass. Like, this Nabatean horse archer is elite tier horse archer, but they still come from your second population class. Absolutely love this horse archer. As good as a Scythian horse archer, as good as a Parthian horse archer. Absolutely amazing horse archer. You can go full Mongol with the Nabataeans. If you bring 19 of these in an army, I won't be surprised, and I won't at all criticize you. Like, that would be a solid play. If this horse archer is just solid, man, just bring them. Absolutely love this unit, and I'd recommend them over to camel archer. And this unit is definitely, like, just considering, like, how good it is for a tier 2 horse archer, like, we're definitely better than anything up here, just in terms of, like, how good this is compared to other options in the game. And your Nabatean camel rider, I already went over it with the general. I recommended bringing this general every time for a reason. Solid in melee, great as a skirmisher. Like, if I'm praising these guys at high heavens, these guys have 10 more range, and they have 1 more weapon missile damage. The only thing that this horse archer is better at compared to the camel is they do shoot faster. But the camel, you know, the camels do scare horses. Although the horse archer is better in melee combat, just, like, offensively. So, you know what? Like, overall, the horse archer is really good, but the camel is really good too. Like, these are 2 super elite tier options. And unlike a lot of other elite horse archers that get kind of heavy, these guys maintain incredible speed. You know, the camels have 7, the horse archer has 8. So these guys are incredibly fast and good for what they are. But your Nabatean heavy camel riders, which you get with the Pharaoh's reforms, are way better at melee combat than your horse archer. Like, 9 melee attack and 13 melee defense is solid. You know, overall, this unit has, like, basically, like, the melee ability of a citizen cavalry, but 41 armor, which is, like, extremely good. And they throw javelins, and they have 90 men. So again, like, you know, citizen cavalry only have 75. So as good as citizens, but they have javelins. They have regular, okay javelins. 7 speed, elite tier armor, and they scare horses. I've tried these guys out, and I've been able to beat cataphracts with them. They are super duper good. Bring this unit in abundance if you can. They're totally worth the elite price. This is your best cavalry unit. By far. An inspiration in melee. Not the best cavalry unit in the game, hands down. Like, there's some things that'll lose head to head to. But it's a top, like, 5%er for sure. Maybe top 3%er. Insanely good cavalry unit. When you combine these with amazing horse archers, amazing camel archers, some really cost-effective low tiers, some strategically viable mid tiers here, and, you know, an uninspired but still capable general, you just have so many cavalry options. And you combine that with having really cost-effective, like 4 super cost-effective skirmish options, and you have to use these guys to bail out your infantry, which are terrible until you get your late Nabatean infantry. And that's the way Nabatea works. That's the way Nabatea works. You know, you have a lot of flaws up here, but a lot of class down here. Because of that, you're going to have to be extremely micromanaging with your armies. This is a hard army to use, particularly against powerhouse factions like the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and the Parthians, who are going to eventually invade your region. So because of that, guys, this is a hard campaign. It's a hard campaign. You don't have the economic buffs and the safety of the Sabaeans. I would say with this campaign, it's like a good 7 out of 10. You know, you have to use your military effectively. As for the military, it is powerful. It is powerful because the camels and missiles are just insanely good. I would say that the melee infantry and spears are a bit of a limitation, but you have to account for the late game supremacy of the late Nabatean infantry. Like I said, these guys beat the majority of elite tier swords in the game. And when you combine these guys with, you know, a valuable but ultimately still a good spear unit, still a good elite spear unit, you know, once you have these guys, you can make up for these guys, you know, and then great cavalry and great missile infantry, these guys can be really good. Because of that, I'm going to give these guys a 7.5 out of 10 on the power rating. Strong, but flawed. You know, not a power faction, but definitely an upper tier faction for sure. Mostly because of cavalry and missiles. Like, they have some great options, you know? I would say them in the Nabatea, you know, for like kind of the Western, but how do I put this? Like, of all, you know, I can't say Western Eastern faction. That's like an oxymoron. But at the end of the day, like, you know, we could say of the southern barbarian factions, right? The ones that are more towards the western part of the map, you know, the Nabatea and the Nabataeans, they're definitely the powerhouses. But I think the Nabataeans, just because they do have, like, fantastic cavalry. Actually, you know, it doesn't make much sense to put the Nabataeans above the Nabatea. You know, it's tied with the Nabatea, I would say. Let's give them both a 7. Let's give them both a 7. Nabataeans are going to be 7 power-wise. But ultimately a 7 difficulty-wise too, because, you know, start position is really hard, and until you get these guys, you are working with a flawed roster. In terms of how much you should play them, I'd say I'd give it a good 5 out of 10. You know, ultimately, I wouldn't say that the Nabataeans are, in my opinion, like, one of the most charming factions. I actually kind of like Saba more. Because, you know, just how generic the buffs and debuffs were, but kind of takes away from how much I think that they're worth playing. Like, you don't manage them differently than any other faction. Like, just their military is unique, but, you know, you're also, in my opinion, sandwiched between more interesting factions. Like, the faction that will be your adversaries, like the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Parthians. I'd rather play all of those more than the Nabateans. Like, this roster just doesn't speak to me much. So, just my own biased opinion, I think it's a 5 out of 10 in terms of how much you should play. But it's a perfectly average faction. You know, it's not like it's an uncharming faction. I don't think that there's anything that compels me to play these guys more than others, but they do have a pretty wide-ranging roster. They do have some interesting foes to face in their campaigns. We do have some interesting challenges to overcome, and a playstyle that is pretty unique. So, it's an average faction to play, in my opinion. But that's all I have to say about the Nabataeans. You know, it's cool what the Divide and Impera team did with the Arabic factions. I like them, and I do like Saba. I think that they added a lot of charm to them, as well as maybe got rid of some of the more overpowering components from Rome 2, because they were added kind of later in the game's life, and I feel like in vanilla, they're a little bit too powerful. In some ways, I feel like the Divide and Impera balanced them and made them pretty fair. But I'd love to know what you think, you know? If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment. I always love to hear you guys' opinion on the game. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.